For over 1,000 years, a city built on mud and wooden stakes rose to become the most powerful force in the Mediterranean. It began with refugees, ordinary people fleeing relentless violence, who somehow forged an empire more enduring than Rome itself. Across 117 rulers, countless wars, and centuries defined by salt, silk, and blood. This is the story of Venice, told through the lives of those who shaped it. Before we begin, if you're a regular here, you know the rhythm, a like, a subscribe, whatever feels right. And I'm always curious, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Last week, someone from Edinburgh wrote that it was 3 o'clock in the morning and they were still wide awake. Honestly, same energy. We're all just doing our best to get through. So tonight, we journey back to ancient Italy, but first, settle in. Get comfortable. Fluff your pillows. Pull up a blanket. Where we're headed, comfort matters. Trust me. Imagine this. You're running for your life, not from soldiers or outlaws, but from something far worse. From Attila, the one they call the Scourge of God, the man whose horse, they say, leaves only dead grass in its wake. Right now, his army is sweeping through northern Italy like wildfire through dry wheat. You're a farmer you were. Your name is Aurelius. You had a modest plot of land near Aquilare, once among the grandest cities in Italy. That once matters because just 3 days ago, Attila's Huns crested the hills and your entire world ended in a single afternoon. The screaming began at noon. You remember that, oddly? How the worst moment of your life unfolded beneath a flawless blue sky, cloudless, indifferenties, if the heavens couldn't be bothered to mourn what was happening below. You grabbed your wife, your daughter, your young son, still small enough to carry Anne, left everything, your grandfather's house, the farming tools that sustained 3 generations, the little wooden chest where you kept your savings. All gone. Now you stand at the edge of a lagoon, staring at something you've never seen, islands. Dozens of them, scattered across shallow water that shimmers green and brown in the afternoon light. Reeds everywhere, birds wheeling overhead, the air thick with the scent of salt, mud, and something faintly rotting. It's no paradise, but it has one crucial advantage. Attila's cavalry can't follow you here. His siege engines are useless on water. His supply lines can't navigate channels, marshes, and shifting mud. The place that looks like nothing. The place most would overlook your only hope. You're not alone. Hundreds, maybe thousands, have fled to this same liminal space. Families from Padua, Concordia, and towns that no longer exist, burned to ash by the Huns. Everyone wears the same expression, stunned, caught between loss and survival. An old fisherman beckons you. His name is Pet. He's lived on an island called Torcello for years, mostly harvesting salt, some fishing. It's not much, he says, but it's a life. He offers you space in his hut, though hut is generous. It's sticks, mud, and a thatch roof of reeds. The floor is packed earth that turns to sludge when it rains. Mosquitoes swarm at dusk, rising from the marshes like tiny vampires. Herbs help a little, but not enough. And the smell, brackish, swampy, metallic, seeps into your clothes, your hair, your sleep. It's alien, yet oddly familiar. The smell of salt, of low tide, of life clinging to water. The water itself defies easy definition, neither fully sea nor fresh. It shifts color with the light, the season, the tide, green in the shallows, brown near the marshes, almost blue when the sun strikes it just right. You've never lived anywhere so saturated with water, so shaped by its rhythms. But you're alive. Your family is alive. For now, that's everything. Here's what no one tells you about being a refugee. It's not just the flight. It's what comes after the slow, grinding alchemy of turning nothing into something. That first night, your 7-year-old daughter asks when you're going home. She's old enough to grasp that something terrible happened, too young to understand that home no longer exists. You tell her soon. It's a lie, but sometimes lies are the raft that carries us through the darkest waters. Sleep doesn't come easy. The sounds are all wrong. Water slapping against wooden posts instead of crickets. Strange birds calling instead of wind in olive trees. Your wife cries quietly in the dark, and you pretend not to notice because you have no comfort to offer. Morning arrives anyway, and with it, the real work begins. Living in a lagoon isn't like living on solid ground. You can't plant crops. The soil is too salty, too wet. You can't raise livestock. There's no pasture. You can't rely on the old ways. So you adapt. Petrus teaches you to build fish traps, wooden stakes driven into the mud, woven with reeds into mazes that lure fish in but never let them out. Some days, the traps yield enough to feed your family. Some days, nothing. The salt pans are more reliable. You learn to shape shallow pools where seawater evaporates, leaving behind crystals of pure white salt. It sounds simple. It demands constant tending, and a single storm can wipe out a season's labor. You must read the weather, the tides, the wind. You must know when to add water and when to let it sit. Above all, you must cultivate patience. The Venetians would one day call salt vero fundament, the true foundation of our state. And they weren't wrong. Everything Venice would become began here, in these salt pans, with refugees mastering a new craft because they had no other choice. Salt, it turns out, is priceless. In a world without refrigeration, it's the only thing that keeps meat from spoiling, the only way to preserve fish through winter. Armies march on salted provisions. Ships sail with barrels of salted fish in their holds. People will trade desperately needed goods for it. Within a year, you've built a fragile system: fish for food, salt for trade, reeds for shelter. It's not prosperity, but it's stability. And after everything you've lost, stability feels like grace. The lagoon changes you. On land, your world was fixed. Your farm here, your village there, roads connecting them. But in the lagoon, boundaries blur. Water is your road. Boats are your feet. You learn the tide's high water opens channels that trap you at low tide. The moon's phases become vital. You attune yourself to rhythms you never knew existed. Slowly, without realizing it, you stop thinking of yourself as a refugee waiting to return. You begin to see yourself as a lagoon dweller. This watery maze, these islands, these channels becomes home. Your son grows up knowing no other life. He navigates the channels better than you ever could. He knows which islands flood during the aqua alta, where the oyster beds hide, where deadly currents pull unwary boats out to sea. He is Venetian, though that word doesn't yet exist. Years pass. Attila dies choking on his own blood on his wedding night. The Huns scatter. But you don't go back. None of you do, because the mainland remains dangerous. The Huns were just the beginning. Next come the Ostrogoths, then the Byzantines trying to reclaim Italy, then the Lombards carving up the peninsula like a feast. Each wave of violence sends more refugees into the lagoon. Aquileia once great is destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again until people abandon it for good. Many of its survivors end up here, adding their skills, their labor, their hope to the growing communities. By the time your grandchildren are born, real towns, the islands. Torcello has a church. Heraclea rises on one cluster of islets. Each develops its own character, its own trades, its own petty rivalries. But then comes the question, who's in charge? In most places, power arrives on horseback, warlords, kings, conquerors with swords. But the lagoon defies that logic. You can't conquer islands without boats. You can't rule fishermen who can simply sail away. You can't tax salt harvesters who can abandon one pan and build another elsewhere. So instead of conquest, there's consensus. Instead of tyranny, negotiation. And in 726, something extraordinary happens. The island communities gather and hold an election. They choose a litera dux in Latin, which becomes doge in the Venetian tongue. His name is Orso, and he is the first in a line that will endure for more than a millennium. Think about that. 1,000 years of elected leaders, not hereditary kings, not warlords. Officials chosen by consent, governed by law and counsel. It wasn't modern democracy only. The wealthy voted only the powerful, truly influenced decisions. But in an age of feudal lords and serfs, it was revolutionary. A republic in a world of crowns. A flicker of something like freedom in an era of bondage. And it all began with refugees desperate, displaced people, building something new in a place no one else wanted. The irony is exquisite. The great empires of antiquity fell to barbarian hordes. Rome collapsed. But from the ruins, in the unlikeliest mudflat, something new took roots, something that would dominate the Mediterranean. Birth masterpieces of art and architecture, and prove what a republic could achieve. That first doge likely had no vision of marble palaces or imperial fleets. He was probably just trying to mediate fishing disputes and organize defense against pirates. He couldn't have imagined that 11 centuries later, his successors would rule an empire stretching from the Adriatic to Constantinople, command the mightiest navy of the medieval world, and preside over a city so rich, so beautiful, so improbable that the world would call it La Serenissimo, the most serene republic. But that's how history unfolds, not in grand declarations, but in small, stubborn choices. A farmer fleeing to the lagoon, a fisherman offering shelter, a community choosing cooperation over chaos. Venice wasn't built in a day or a century. It was built by generations choosing again and again to stay, to build, to adapt, to endure. And somehow against every expectation it worked. Your great-great-grandchildren are Venetians now. They've never known dry land as home. The mudflats where Aurelius first landed have been reinforced with wooden platforms, paved with stone. There are proper houses, churches, markets, bustling with goods from across the sea. The salt trade has made some families wealthy. Fishing has given others comfort, and everywhere there's a sense of possibility, of belonging to something unprecedented. Venice is becoming Venice, but building is only half the battle. The other half is survival. And in the centuries ahead, Venice will face trials that make Attila seem like a minor inconvenience, rival empires, plagues that kill half the population, religious schisms, economic meltdowns. Yet it will endure through cunning, resilience, and an almost supernatural sense of its own destiny. That's a longer tale, one involving stolen relics, blind generals leading armies, merchants dictating travelogues from prison cells, and even a cat that went to war. But for now, as you sink deeper into your cushions, think of Aurelius, the terrified farmer whose flight became the seed of an empire. Think of how our darkest hours sometimes sow the seeds of our greatest legacies. And think of the lagoon, that liminal world of mud, reeds, an endless possibility still there, still home to those who wouldn't live anywhere else. Venice sleeps tonight on its wooden stakes, cradled by water, shielded by its own impossibility. And tomorrow, the story continues. Now, here's where things take a strange turn. Venice has grown. Nearly 4 centuries have passed since the first refugees arrived. The mud huts are gone, replaced by stone houses, bustling docks, and a doge's palace that gleams with authority. Trade routes stretch across the Mediterranean. Ships arrive and depart with silks, glass, grain, and gold. But something vital is missing. In medieval Europe, a city needed more than wealth. It needed a saint. Not just any saint, but a major one. A figure so revered that pilgrims would journey for months just to kneel before his relics. Pilgrims brought money, prestige, legitimacy. Rome had Peter and Paul. Constantinople had a treasury of holy remains. Venice had local martyrs, decent enough for a feast day, but nothing to command awe. To Venetian merchants Bueno and Rustico set out to change that. In Alexandria, they learned that the body of Saint Mark, the evangelist, the author of one of the Gospels, the founder of the Alexandrian church, lay in a modest tomb. Neglected under Muslim rule, they looked at each other. A plan took shape. They would steal a saint. Relic theft was common in those days, framed not as theft, but as rescue, liberating holy remains from unworthy hands. But smuggling a body out of Alexandria under Muslim guards, that required cunning. They bribed the custodians, accessed the tomb, removed the body, and then wrapped it in layers of pork. When customs inspectors approached, they recoiled at the sight of unclean meat and waved the barrels through without inspection. The ship set sail. Storms raged, of course they did. Legend says Saint Mark himself appeared to the captain, warning of hidden rocks. The ship survived, and one spring day, Saint Mark arrived in Venice. The city erupted. Bells pealed from every campanile. Crowds surged to the harbor. The Doge himself descended, flanked by clergy and nobles. Women wept. Men crossed themselves. Children scrambled onto rooftops to catch a glimpse. After centuries as a refuge for the displaced, Venice finally had a patron saint, an apostle, a gospel writer, a figure of global reverence. They built him a church, the Basilica di San Marco, adorned with gold and mosaics so dazzling it announced to the world that Venice was no backwater. When the first church burned in 976, they rebuilt it, grander still. The version standing today was completed in 1094. Its winged lion, Mark's Symbolby, came Venice's emblem, stamped on flags, ships, and every conquered port as a sign of divine favor. But saints don't fill coffers. Trade does. Consider Giacomo, a third-generation Venetian merchant around the year 1100. His grandfather fled the mainland. His father built boats. Giacomo trades in spices, pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from islands so distant their names are whispers in Europe. These aren't mere luxuries. In a world of bland, rotting food, spices preserve flavor and signify status. The wealthy will pay absurd sums for them. And Venice controls the pipeline. Here's how it works. Goods from the Far East travel overland and by sea to ports like Alexandria and Antioch. Venetian galleys meet them there, load their holds, and sail west through the Aegean, past Crete, into the Adriatic, delivering silks, dyes, incense, and above all, spices to markets. From Genoa, his warehouse overflows. His family builds a palazzo along the Grand Canal, and with every ship that returns laden with treasure, Venice grows richer, bolder, more indispensable. Thus, on foundations of salt and refuge, a city of miracles rises not by conquest alone, but by commerce, faith, and the quiet determination of those who refuse to vanish into history. Goods from the Far East, spices, silks, precious stones, arrive in Europe by two great arteries, the overland routes of the Silk Road or the maritime paths across the Indian Ocean. Either way, they converge in one place, Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, glittering with gold domes and teeming with merchants from every corner of the known world. It is there that Venetian traders like Giacomo make their move. They arrive in sleek galleys, their holds packed with Italian wine, grain, wool, and glass goods the Byzantines desire. They sell these wares in the grand markets beneath the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, then turn around and spend every coin on the treasures of the East: pepper that burns the tongue, cinnamon that smells of distant forests, bolts of silk so fine they feel like liquid, and dyes so rich they never fade. Then they load it all onto their ships and sail west, back across the Aegean, through the straits, and into the lagoon that cradles Venice. From there, the floodgates open. Venice becomes the funnel through which the wealth of Asia enters Europe. It is the indispensable middleman, the gatekeeper, the broker, the silent partner in a global exchange. And with every transaction, Venice takes its cut. Not a modest percentage, a commanding slice, enough to build palaces, fund armies, and rewrite the balance of power in the Mediterranean. JKAMO, single quotes, as life unfolds like a well-worn map. He departs Venice with a cargo of grain and fine wine staples that feed and delight the Byzantine elite. The journey east is never simple. The Adriatic, though familiar, is fickle, capable of unleashing storms without warning. But the true test lies farther south, around the Peloponnese, that jagged hook of land. Their currents clash like warring spirits, and the winds twist in maddening directions. A wrong turn can mean shipwreck or worse spirits. After 2 decades on these waters, Giacomo knows every safe cove, every rocky outcrop where corsairs might lie in wait. He knows which Byzantine customs officials expect a discreet bribe. He knows which warehouses in Constantinople stock the purest pepper, and which dilute their spices with sand or sawdust to stretch profits in the heart of Constantinople. The markets overwhelm the senses. Dozens of languages echo off marble columns. Faces from lands Giacomo can barely name Persians, Armenians, Arabs, Turkspotter in a babel of tongues. The air is thick with the scent of cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, perfume so potent it stings the eyes. Even after all these years, the city hums with a kind of terrifying grandeur. He trades his Italian cargo for Eastern luxuries, then begins the return voyage. Back in Venice, he sells everything at a staggering markup. The margins are enormous, but the risks are equally vast. Pirates haunt the sea lanes. Storms swallow ships whole. Political tensions can shut down entire trade networks overnight. Giacomo has lost friends to all three. He's lost entire shipments. He's nearly died twice, once in a tempest near Crete. Once fleeing Saracen raiders who chased his galley for 2 days before giving up. Yet the rewards are beyond measure. His home is no longer a wooden hut on a reed-choked islet. It is a stone and brick palazzo rising proudly along the Grand Canal. He employs servants. His wife dresses in Byzantine silk dyed with Tyrian purple. His children will never know hunger, never shiver in a mud hut while mosquitoes feast on their blood. They are heirs to a new Venice of wealth, influence, and ambition. And with wealth comes power. Venice needs ships, not just a few, but hundreds. Merchant vessels to carry goods, war galleys to defend them. Building them one by one in scattered private yards can't keep pace with demand. So Venice does what no other city has dared. It creates a factory. In the early 12th century, construction begins on the arsenal, a shipyard so vast it defies comparison. 45 acres of docks, workshops, foundries, and warehouses stretch behind towering brick walls 2 miles long. Guards patrol the gates. Silence is enforced by oath and threat. To betray the arsenal's secrets is to invite death. Foreign powers have tried everything: bribes, espionage, kidnapping skilled workers, but none have penetrated its walls. Inside, something astonishing takes shape. The world's first industrial assembly line, centuries before the term exists. Consider Marco, a carpenter of the Arsenalata, elite guild of shipbuilders whose craft is passed from father to son. Marco doesn't build entire ships. He builds only one part, the wooden frames that form a galley's skeleton. Day after day, he cuts the same curves, fits the same joints, until his hands move with unconscious precision. Nearby, other teams specialize. One crafts hulls, another fashions oars, another shapes masts. Each group masters a single task with obsessive focus. When a new ship is commissioned, its hull floats through a network of canals that thread the arsenal like veins. At each station, components are added: frames, planks, rigging, sails, until the vessel emerges, complete and ready for sea, fully armed, fully provisioned, from keel to masthead, outfitted in days. At its peak, the arsenal launches a finished war galley every single day. No other power can match this output. None even come close. When Venice loses ships in battle, it replaces them faster than enemies can sink them. This isn't just shipbuilding, it's strategic dominance forged in wood and iron. The work is grueling. Marco rises at dawn to the toll of the Marangona bell, the carpenter's call ringing from the Campanile in St. Mark's Square. He labors until sunset, but the arsenal cares for its workers. Wine flows freely, 6 deliveries a day, carried in great jugs. Workers consume hundreds of thousands of liters yearly, nearly 2 liters per person every day. It may explain the occasional accident, but it also fosters loyalty. The Arsenati are proud. They know they are Venice's backbone. Even Dante, the poet who walked through hell in his Inferno, visited the arsenal around 1300. He watched men boil pitch in massive cauldrons, black, bubbling tar used to seal ships against the sea. Later, in his description of Hell's 8th circle, he wrote of sinners submerged in boiling pitch, prodded by demons. Many believe he borrowed the image directly from the arsenal's workshop, steaming, sulphurous, and relentless. This industrial might makes Venice untouchable. Pirates once plagued the Adriatic, hiding in Dalmatian coves to ambush merchant vessels. Venice responded, not with patrols, but with conquest. One by one, it seized every island, every coastal stronghold, until the entire eastern Adriatic bowed to the Lion of St. Mark by the turn of the millennium. The Doge styled himself Duke of Dalmatia. The pirates faded into memory, but greater challenges loom. The Byzantine Empire, Venice's chief trading partner, grows weaker. New powers rise in the Mediterranean, and Venice, hungry, shrewd, always watching, senses opportunity. An army gathers in Western Europe. Thousands of knights from France, Germany, and Italy bind crosses to their tunics, swearing oaths to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. They are crusaders, holy warriors seeking salvation through blood and conquest. But they cannot march overland through hostile lands. The sea is their only path, and the sea belongs to Venice. Jakamo is an old man now. His son runs the business. His grandson studies ledgers and cargo manifests. He remembers when Venice was nothing but refugees huddled on mudflats, praying to survive the night. He has watched it grow into a titan, feared, respected, wealthy beyond imagining. He doesn't know it yet, but Venice's greatest transformation is still ahead. The Crusaders need ships. Venice has them. And at the helm of the Republic stands a man unlike any before or since. Enrico Dandolo, 90 years old, completely blind and sharper than any blade in the arsenal. No one knows exactly how he lost his sight. Some say Byzantine agents seared his eyes with hot irons during a failed diplomatic mission. Others claim a head injury robbed him of vision. Perhaps he saw only shadows. It scarcely matters. What matters is this: a man who could not see the world saw its workings more clearly than anyone alive. Elected Doge at 85 an age. When most men are long in their graves, Dandolo was not retiring. He was just beginning. In the spring, a delegation of French knights arrives in Venice. They seek passage for 30,000 warriors, plus horses and supplies, to sail to Egypt, the strategic gateway to Jerusalem. Only Venice can provide such a fleet. They meet Dandolo in the Doge's palace, chamber of marble and mosaics, lit by candlelight. The old man sits, blind but alert, flanked by advisors. The French are eager, even desperate. They've sworn public vows. Backing out would be humiliation before all Christendom. Dandolo listens. He asks precise questions. He weighs every word. Then he offers terms. Venice will build transports for 4,500 knights, 9,000 squires, 20,000 foot soldiers. Sond provide 50 war galleys at its own expense. In return, the Crusaders will pay 85,000 silver marks and grant Venice half of all lands they conquer. It's an astronomical sum more than the annual income of the King of England. But the French, trapped by their own zeal, agree. Venice mobilizes. The arsenal surges into overdrive. Timber floods in from alpine forests. Blacksmiths forge anchors day and night. Rope makers twist cables until their fingers bleed. For more than a year, the entire city becomes a machine devoted to building this fleet, the largest assembled in the Mediterranean since Rome. Hundreds of ships fill the lagoon, ready, waiting, costly. Then the Crusaders arrive, and the plan unravels. Only 11,000 men show up. They cannot pay, even after emptying their coffers and pledging their jewels. They are 34,000 marks short. The fleet sits idle. The crusade stalls, and Dandolo seizes his moment. He walks blind, ancient into the crowd of stranded warriors. He mounts a platform and speaks. I am old. I am weak, but I cannot abandon Christ's pilgrims. If you will have me, I shall take the cross and go with you. The crowd erupts. Here is a dogenerally a century-old, sightless offering to die for their cause. It's stirring. It's holy theater, and it distracts them completely from the real issue, money. Then Dandolo delivers his true condition. Venice will forgive the debt temporarily if the Crusaders do one small favor on their way to Egypt: retake the city of Zara, a Christian port on the Dalmatian coast that once belonged to Venice, but now answers to the King of Hungary. The Crusaders hesitate, attacking fellow Christians, especially a king who has also taken the crosses, a grave sin. But what choice do they have? Stranded, broke, and humiliated, they agree. In late autumn, the fleet arrives at Zara. The citizens hang crosses from their walls, pleading for mercy. It does no good. The city falls in 5 days. The Crusaders plunder it, and the Pope, horrified, excommunicates the entire expedition. Imagine it. Men who left their homes to save their souls, now damned by the very church they sought to serve. Their pilgrimage has become a sacrilege. Their crusade, a curse. They winter in Zara, lost and desperate until a new hope appears. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac, arrives with a dazzling proposition. Help me retake Constantinople. Restore my father. In return, I'll pay your debt to Venice, supply your army all the way to Jerusalem, and even submit the Orthodox Church to the Pope's authority. It's a fantasy. But the Crusaders, drowning in debt and divine condemnation, grasp at it like a lifeline. Dandolo knows better. He knows the Byzantines cannot deliver, but he has other reasons to go east. Decades earlier, the Byzantine emperor had imprisoned thousands of Venetian merchants in Constantinople, seizing their goods, leaving many to die. Dandolo was there. Some say that's when he was blinded, punished for his boldness. Whether true or not, he never forgot. And he never forgave. Now, Revenge wears the mask of opportunity. The fleet sails east. In the summer, they assault Constantinople. The blind Doge stands at the prow of his galley, the banner of St. Mark snapping above him, and leads the charge against the sea walls. At 90, armored and unseeing, he is first on to the ramparts. The defenders break. The usurper flees. Alexios and his father are crowned, but the new emperor cannot pay. The treasury is empty. The people despise the foreign army camped outside their gates. Riots erupt. A fire consumes a quarter of the city. And in the chaos, Alexios and his father are murdered by their own people. A new emperor takes the throne and tells the crusaders to leave. They do not. In the spring, they attack again, this time not as liberators, but as conquerors for 3 days. The greatest Christian city in the world is ravaged by fellow Christians. Palaces are gutted. Churches are stripped bare. Monasteries burn. Mosaics are smashed for their gems. Bronze statues, some dating to antiquity, are melted down for scrap. The Hagia Sophia, heart of Eastern Christendom, becomes a stable. Soldiers drink sacramental wine from chalices, lead pack mules through its nave, and rip silver from altars. The people suffer horribly. Priests are slain at their altars. Nuns are dragged from convents. Chronicles later claim even the Saracens would have shown more mercy. The French and Flemish crusaders loot in a frenzy driven by greed, rage, and the frenzy of conquest. The Venetians act differently. They are methodical. They inventory the plunder as if balancing a ledger. This icon, that relic, these gems, those tapestries. They take only the finest, the most valuable, the most symbolic. Among their prizes are the famed bronze horses enchant statues that had adorned Constantinople's hippodrome for 8 centuries. Venice ships them home and mounts them above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica, where they remain to this day, the originals now sheltered indoors, the copies standing in their stead. For centuries, they serve as a silent boast. This is what Venice can do. This is what Venice has taken. The Venetians also seize relics by the cartload, fragments of the true cross, the arm of St. George, the supposed head of John the Baptist. Their churches fill with sacred trophies from the East. When the dust settles, the Crusaders carve up the Byzantine Empire. A Latin emperor, French count, takes the throne in Constantinople. But the true victor is Venice. Dandolo is granted the title Lord of 3/8 of the Roman Empire. Venice claims Crete, the Aegean Islands, and key ports along the Greek coast's strategic outposts they call the Eyes of the Republic, watching over the sea lanes that feed their wealth. No longer do they beg for access to Eastern markets. Now they control them. Dandolo dies in Constantinople the following year. He is buried in the Hagia Sophia, the church he helped turn into a Catholic cathedral. His tomb remains, though his bones are likely lost to time and conquest. His legacy endures. Venice enters the 13th century as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The blind old man, unable to see the world, had seen further into its future than any king or pope. He had turned a holy war into a commercial triumph. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Byzantine Empire, though it limped on for 2 more centuries, never recovered its glory. Thousands died not for Christ, but for Venetian profit. That is the paradox of Venice, a city of sublime beauty, enlightened governance, and republican ideals, but beneath its golden mosaics and marble facades ran cold, calculating steel. Venice did what was necessary, took what it wanted, and never once apologized. The bronze horses still watch over St. Mark's Square. In certain lights, they seem to remember an empire crumbling, a city in flames, and an old blind man smiling through the smoke far from the lagoon. In a Genoese prison, another Venetian sits in darkness. Marco Polo, 44 years old, rubs his wrists where the manacles chafed. The cell is damp, the air thick with the scuttle of rats. It is 1298. Venice and Genoa rivals for Mediterranean supremacy are locked in war. Marco was captured during a naval skirmish, his galley overwhelmed. Now he waits, wondering if he'll be ransomed or forgotten. He has seen things few in Europe can fathom: deserts that swallow caravans, mountains where the air thins to nothing, courts where emperors rule lands larger than Christendom itself. Then he meets Rustichello, a writer from Pisa, long imprisoned for his own forgotten war. Rustichello pens romances, tales of Arthur, Lancelot, and enchanted castles. Bored and curious, he listens as Marco begins to speak. And what a story it is. 20-4 years of travel. 17 spent in the service of Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who rules China and half of Asia. Marco left Venice as a boy, following his father and uncle on their second journey east. They crossed Armenia, Persia, the high plateaus of Central Asia lands, where fires burn blue and the wind carries voices from distant ages. They traversed deserts so vast that travelers spoke of mirages that drove men mad. Now, locked in a stone cell, Marco recounts it all. The Khan's summer palace at Xanadu, rivers of gold, paper money, coal that burns like wood, postal riders who cross empires in days. Rustichello takes notes, weaving fact and wonder into a narrative that will astonish Europe. Thus, from a prison cell, the travels of Marco Polo is born, not just a travelogue, but a revelation. It opens Europe's eyes to a world beyond its narrow seas, and in doing so, it fuels the dreams of future explorers, merchants, and empire builders, many of whom will look to Venice, that improbable city on water, as the model of what commerce, cunning, and courage can achieve. Vast landscapes stretched endlessly before them, deserts so immense one could walk for weeks without glimpsing a single tree. They passed through cities whose names shimmered like poetry: Samarkand, Kashgar, Khotan, and then, at last, they reached China. Marco Polo was speechless at first. How could he possibly describe a civilization so advanced that everything he had known in Europe, every custom, every structure, every assumption, suddenly seemed crude and backward? In China, he saw cities teeming with 1 million souls, while Venice counted barely a tenth of that number. He traveled along roads paved with stone, stretching straight as arrows across hundreds of miles, engineering feats unmatched in Christendom. He witnessed a postal system so efficient that messages traversed the empire in mere days, carried by riders who passed scrolls at relay, stations spaced with mathematical precision. And then there was the money in Venice. Wealth meant coins, gold and silver, that could be weighed, bitten, tested for authenticity. But in China, the Great Khan issued paper notes stamped with his imperial seal, and these slips of parchment bought anything: silk, spices, horses, land. The people accepted them without hesitation, not because the paper had intrinsic worth, but because the Khan's authority gave it value. This concept fiat currency was so alien that when Marco later tried to explain it to Europeans, they laughed in his face. Paper as money. You expect us to believe that? He showed them other marvels too, black stones pulled from the earth that burned hotter and longer than wood coal, which Europeans had never thought to use as fuel. He described noodles stretched so long they seemed endless, fireworks that exploded into blossoms of light in the night sky. Gunpowder used not for war, but for celebration. Try explaining fireworks to someone who's never seen them. You light a powder. It shoots into the air, and then no wonder they doubted him. He encountered animals unknown in the West: elephants lumbering through royal processions, rhinoceroses armored like mythical beasts. He saw communication networks that made European messengers look primitive, roads so straight and vast they defied imagination, and a bureaucracy so orderly it could feed, clothe, and govern an empire larger than all of Christendom combined. Kublai Khan, ruler of this magnificent realm, took a liking to the young Venetian. He employed Marco as an envoy, sending him on missions across his domains. Marco learned to observe with precision, to report with clarity, to discern which details mattered most. In the Khan's service, usefulness meant privilege, and Marco lived well. Years later, imprisoned in a Genoese cell, Marco would recount these wonders to Rustichello of Pisa, a writer of chivalric romances. Rustichello, bored and brilliant, recognized the gold in Marco's memories. Together, they wrote The Travels of Marco Polo, a book that would ignite the imagination of Europe. Copies spread like wildfire. People devoured tales of Cathay and Zipangu, of golden roofs and paper money, of cities where order and abundance reigned. Yet many refused to believe. Where were the dog-headed men, the one-eyed giants, the monsters that adorned every other traveler's tale? Why didn't Marco mention tea, or the Great Wall, or the practice of foot-binding? Skeptics mocked him as Marco Millions, accusing him of fabricating riches to impress gullible audiences. Even on his deathbed, friends urged him to recant, confess the lies, save your soul. But Marco stood firm. I have not told half of what I saw, he said. Not even half. Meanwhile, back in Venice, the city Marco loved was fighting for its very survival. Venice and Genoa, two maritime republics, both built on trade, both convinced the Mediterranean could hold only one master, were locked in a bitter, generations-long rivalry. Venice dominated the eastern routes, Constantinople, Alexandria, the sea lanes that Dandelo's crusade had secured. Genoa pushed north into the Black Sea, planting colonies along the Crimean coast, tapping into the overland Silk Roads that Marco's own family had once traveled. Every few decades, competition erupted into war. They clashed in the Aegean, where both claimed islands and trading posts. They battled off Syria's coast, where crusader states played them against each other. They fought in the Black Sea over grain and slaves. These were not skirmishes, but full-scale naval wars, fleets of hundreds of galleys, thousands of men, oars churning the sea into froth. The battle that captured Marco involved nearly 200 ships. The water ran red. Neither side could deliver a final blow. Both were too wealthy, too stubborn, too certain that yielding meant ruin. Genoa forged alliances. The Duke of Austria, the King of Hungary, the city of Padua, eager to clip Venice's wings. Venice scrambled for allies of its own. Milan, Cyprus, even the fractured remnants of Byzantium. But when the crisis came, Venice stood largely alone. In 1379, the Genoese fleet sailed up the Adriatic not to raid, but to invade. Hungarian cavalry swept down from the north. Paduan soldiers crossed river borders. For the first time in memory, Venice faced assault from land and sea. The enemy struck first at Chioggia, a fishing town just 15 miles south of Venice, close enough that, on clear days, its citizens could see the campanile of St. Mark's rising above the lagoon. After 2 weeks of desperate resistance, Chioggia fell. The Genoese were now inside the lagoon itself. Panic gripped Venice. Refugees flooded the streets. Families packed heirlooms, debated escape routes, sent children to relatives on the mainland. Bread prices soared. Rumors spread like plague. The newly elected Doge, Andrea Contarinas, 70 years old and untested in war, stepped into the breach with astonishing resolve. He called every able-bodied man to arms. Nobles armed their households. Merchants donated fortunes. Peasants who had once fled mainland violence were handed weapons and told, "Fight for the city that gave you shelter." Women melted down jewelry to hire mercenary professional soldiers who sold their swords to the highest bidder. Churches surrendered their gold. Even prisoners were offered freedom in exchange for service. The arsenal, Venice's industrial heart, roared into overdrive. Torches burned through the night. Hammers never ceased. But there was no time to build new ships. The enemy was already at the gates. So the Venetians turned their greatest asset's geography into a weapon. They sank old hulls in the channels, drove wooden piles into the mud, blocked passages with debris. The lagoon, once a refuge for Attila's refugees, became a labyrinthine trap. The Genoese fleet, powerful in open water, found itself confined in Chioggia's shrinking harbor. Winter came. Fog blanketed the lagoon. Supply ships got lost in the maze of reeds and tides. Some ran aground. Others were ambushed by Venetian galleys, whose crews knew every current, every hidden shoal. Food dwindled. Sickness spread. The Genoese, once invaders, became prisoners in a watery cage. By spring, Venice struck back not just with oars and swords, but with something new, gunpowder. Cannons mounted on galleys roared across the water, hurling stone shot with terrifying noise and force. The technology was crude, the aim unreliable, but the psychological impact was devastating. Genoese sailors, already cold and hungry, watched decks splinter into splinters with a single blast. Morale collapsed. The Genoese fleet was captured or destroyed. The invasion that had threatened to erase Venice from the map ended in catastrophe for its Precetex. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Turin. On paper, it looked like a stalemate. Venice ceded some claims, paid reparations, accepted trade restrictions. But the aftermath told a different story. Genoa, despite its battlefield victories, imploded. Factions tore the city apart in coups and countercoups. Within decades, it fell under Milanese, then French control, never again a rival to Venice. Venice, by contrast, not only survived, thrived. Within a generation, its galleys were once more sailing east, its treasury overflowing, its palaces rising along the Grand Canal. How? Partly luck, partly geography, but mostly it was the system. Venice had done something rare in medieval Europe, built a government that was ruthless enough to win, yet stable enough to endure. There were no kings, no hereditary tyrants, no civil wars over succession. Power was distributed across a web of councils: the Senate, the Great Council, the Quarantia, the Council of Ten, each checking the others, ensuring no single individual could seize control. The Doge, often dismissed by outsiders as a tavern sign, ornamental but powerless, ruled only with the consent of layers of bureaucracy. Major decisions required approval from multiple bodies. It was slow, cumbersome, maddeningly complex, but once a decision was made, it held. And then there was the Council of Ten, created to investigate a conspiracy. It evolved into Venice's secret police, spies in every port, intercepted letters, informants in taverns and churches. Suspected traitors vanished in the night. Torture chambers whispered beneath the Doge's palace. They were paranoid, yes, but effective. In 1,000 years, Venice experienced fewer internal upheavals than most Italian cities saw in a single century. This was the myth of Venice, the idea that the Republic had perfected governance, blending aristocracy and republicanism into a machine that simply worked. It wasn't perfect. Power remained locked in the hands of noble families listed in the Golden Book. Corruption existed. Some doges were visionaries, others mediocre, but compared to the chaos elsewhere, Venice was a marvel of order. Marco Polo returned from prison to a city that had nearly ceased to exist in his absence. He never traveled again. He married, had daughters, became a quiet merchant among many. But his book lived on, carried centuries later by a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who sailed west searching for the very wonders Marco described. He didn't find Cathaboot, he found something else that would reshape the world. The point remains. While Marco dictated his memories in a damp cell, Venice stood on the brink of annihilation, and yet it endured. The scars healed faster than anyone expected. Trade resumed. The arsenal kept building. New palaces rose. And something else stirred in the air, a new spirit of inquiry, of beauty, of human potential. Scholars unearthed Greek texts. Artists experimented with light and color. The world seemed to be waking from a long sleep. They would later call it the Renaissance, and Venice would become one of its greatest stages. Walk through the city in its golden age, and the air itself hums with creation. At Titian's studio, the scent of linseed oil, turpentine, and powdered lapis lazuli, more valuable than gold, clings to your clothes. Tiziano Vecellio reigns as Venice's supreme painter. Emperors and popes beg for his portraits. His brush captures flesh that glows from within, fabrics that shimmer, eyes that hold entire lifetimes. He works in bursts, abandoning canvases for months, then returning to attack them with fingers as often as brushes. His Venus of Urbino scandalizes and seduces in equal measure. He is not alone. The Bellini brothers shaped the previous generation, training half the artists in Venice. Carpaccio paints vast canvases of processions, ceremonies. The lagoon itself, documents of a city in love with its own reflection. Tintoretto, son of a dyer, works with frenetic speed, his Last Supper swirling with angels, servants, and divine light breaking through darkness. He and Titian despise each other rivalry, sharpened by genius, but Venice is large enough, wealthy enough, to sustain them both, and that wealth flows from trade. Stand on the Rialto, bridge still, wooden, in those days, and watch the Grand Canal pulse with life. Barges carry timber. Galleys return from Alexandria, holds bursting with pepper. Small boats dart between them, ferrying passengers for a few coins. Everything moves by water, because there are no true streets, only canals, footpaths, and bridges linking a constellation of islands. The system functions because every person knows their role. Boatmen, porters, customs officers who tax every bale, every barrel. Venetian merchants, as the German artist Albrecht Dürer bitterly noted during a visit, are the most treacherous, lying, thieving scoundrels imaginable, smiling to your face while picking your pocket, rewriting contracts when your back is turned. Trust is for fools. Negotiation is blood sport, yet this very ruthlessness drives excellence. If your glass isn't clearer, your silk finer, your prices sharper, you vanish from the market. Competition hones quality to a razor's edge. Nowhere is this truer than in Murano, the island where Venice banishes its glassmakers, not just to protect the city from furnace fires, but to guard the Republic's most jealously held secret. Glassblowers are forbidden to leave. Defectors are hunted. Some say they are executed. Others merely made to regret their betrayal. The glass is worth it. Crystal so clear it sings, colors so pure they seem lit from within. Mirrors that show your true face, unlike the distorted funhouse versions sold elsewhere. Across Europe, royalty pays fortunes for Murano glass. Venice also produces silk, rivaling China's, woven by women whose eyesight fails by 40, but whose hands create fabrics that shimmer like liquid sunlight. Cotton arrives, is dyed in vibrant hues, and ships out at vast markups. Wood carvers craft furniture so intricate it becomes heirloom art. On Baroque, women make lace so fine it resembles frozen spiderwebs, each piece taking months, selling for more than its weight in gold. All this activity supports a population of 150,000, crammed onto less than 3 square miles. Privacy is a luxury. You hear your neighbors' arguments, smell their dinner, share their joys and sorrows through thin walls. Then there is printing. In the late 15th century, Venice grants its first printing license to a German immigrant. Within decades, it becomes Europe's publishing capital, producing more books than Florence, Rome, Milan, and Naples combined. Why? Because Venice understands that a book is a commodity like any other. Buy low, produce well, ship where demand is high, and it has Aldus Manutius's scholar obsessed with classical learning. He publishes Greek texts long locked in monasteries, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles. But his true revolution is the octavo, small, portable, affordable books, what we would call paperbacks. Students, merchants, priests carry them across Europe. For the first time, great literature is no longer the sole domain of the wealthy. Venice's press transforms not just commerce, but culture. Paper mills rise on the mainland. Ink makers, typesetters, binders fill entire districts. The city that once shipped spices now ships ideas, and, in the Renaissance, ideas are the most valuable cargo of all. Humanists like Francesco Barbaro correspond across continents. Erasmus comes to collaborate with Aldous, grumbling about the food, but staying for the intellectual ferment. Galileo later demonstrates his telescope to the Doge, who immediately grasps its military value. See the enemy before they see you. Venice buys the design on the spot. This is Venice, in essence, a seamless fusion of art and commerce, beauty and calculation, vision and profit. The same republic that produces Titian and Tintoretto also fields the finest diplomatic corps in Europe, ambassadors in every capital, spies in every court, coded messages flowing back to the Senate. The government demands intelligence on everything. Grain prices in Alexandria, court intrigues in Paris, Ottoman succession disputes. Because in Venice, information is just another form of currency. Walk its streets at peak glory. Cross the Rialto, lined with shops selling silk, spices, sausages. Glide past Palace Escudero, gleaming with gold leaf, the Doge's palace radiating power. Churches bloom with paintings, marble, mosaics. The sounds are a symphony, bells from a dozen campanili each. Walk through the city in its golden age, and the air itself hums with creation. At Titian's studio, the scent of linseed oil, turpentine, and powdered lapis lazuli, more valuable than gold, clings to your clothes. Tiziano Vecellio reigns as Venice's supreme painter. Emperors and popes beg for his portraits. His brush captures flesh that glows from within, fabrics that shimmer, eyes that hold entire lifetimes. He works in bursts, abandoning canvases for months, then returning to attack them with fingers as often as brushes. His Venus of Urbino scandalizes and seduces in equal measure. He is not alone. The Bellini brothers shaped the previous generation, training half the artists in Venice. Carpaccio paints vast canvases of processions, ceremonies. The lagoon itself documents of a city in love with its own reflection. Tintoretto, son of a dyer, works with frenetic speed, his Last Supper swirling with angels, servants, and divine light breaking through darkness. He and Titian despise each other, rivalry sharpened by genius, but Venice is large enough, wealthy enough, to sustain them both, and that wealth flows from trade. Stand on the Rialto, bridge still wooden in those days, and watch the Grand Canal pulse with life. Barges carry timber. Galleys return from Alexandria, holds bursting with pepper. Small boats dart between them, ferrying passengers for a few coins. Everything moves by water. Because there are no true streets, only canals, footpaths, and bridges linking a constellation of islands. The system functions because every person knows their role. Boatmen, porters, customs officers who tax every bale, every barrel. Venetian merchants, as the German artist Albrecht Dürer bitterly noted during a visit, are the most treacherous, lying, thieving scoundrels. Rewriting contracts when your back is turned. Trust is for fools. Negotiation is blood sport. Yet this very ruthlessness drives excellence. If your glass isn't clearer, your silk finer, your prices sharper, you vanish from the market. Competition hones quality to a razor's edge. Nowhere is this truer than in Murano. the island where Venice banishes its glassmakers, not just to protect the city from furnace fires, but to guard the Republic's most jealously held secret. Glassblowers are forbidden to leave. Defectors are hunted. Some say they are executed. Others merely made to regret their betrayal. The glass is worth it. Crystal so clear it sings. Colors so pure they seem lit from within. Mirrors that show your true face unlike the distorted funhouse versions sold elsewhere. Across Europe, royalty pays fortunes for Murano glass. Venice also produces silk rivaling China's, woven by women whose eyesight fails by 40, but whose hands create fabrics that shimmer like liquid sunlight. Cotton arrives, is dyed in vibrant hues, and ships out at vast markups. Woodcarvers craft furniture so intricate it becomes heirloom art. Women make lace so fine it resembles frozen spiderwebs, each piece taking months, selling for more than its weight in gold. All this activity supports a population of 150,000, crammed onto less than 3 square miles. Privacy is a luxury. You hear your neighbors' arguments, smell their dinner, share their joys and sorrows through thin walls. Then there is printing. In the late 15th century, Venice grants its first printing license to a German immigrant. Within decades, it becomes Europe's publishing capital, producing more books than Florence, Rome, Milan, and Naples combined. Because Venice understands that a book is a commodity like any other. Buy low, produce well, ship where demand is high. And it has Aldus Manutius, scholar obsessed with classical learning. He publishes Greek texts long locked in monasteries, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles. But his true revolution is the octavo. Small, portable, affordable books, what we would call paperbacks. Students, merchants, priests carry them across Europe. For the first time, great literature is no longer the sole domain of the wealthy. Venice's press transforms not just commerce, but culture. Paper mills rise on the mainland. Ink makers, typesetters, binders fill entire districts. The city that once shipped spices now ships ideas, and in the Renaissance, ideas are the most valuable cargo of all. Humanists like Francesco Barbaro correspond across continents. Erasmus comes to collaborate with Aldus, grumbling about the food, but staying for the intellectual ferment. Galileo later demonstrates his telescope to the Doge, who immediately grasps its military value. See the enemy before they see you. Venice buys the design on the spot. This is Venice, in essence, a seamless fusion of art and commerce, beauty and calculation, vision and profit. The same republic that produces Titian and Tintoretto also fields the finest diplomatic corps in Europe, ambassadors in every capital, spies in every court, coded messages flowing back to the Senate. The government demands intelligence on everything. Grain prices in Alexandria, court intrigues in Paris, Ottoman succession disputes. Because, in Venice, information is just another form of currency. Walk its streets at peak glory. Cross the Rialto, lined with shops selling silk, spices, sausages. Glide past Palazzo Scudoro, gleaming with gold leaf, the Doge's palace radiating power. Churches bloom with paintings, marble, mosaics. The sounds are a symphony, bells from a dozen campanili, each with its own tone. Boatmen calling warnings around blind corners. Vendors singing of fresh fish and warm bread. the smells are less poetic. Salt, seaweed, fish guts, sewage, the ever-present tang of brine and rot. Yet this is the scent of life that turned refuge into empire, that survived Attila, the Crusades, Genoese invasions, plagues, and time itself. Venice endures not because it is gentle, but because it is adaptable. Not because it is pure, but because it is pragmatic. It builds beauty on foundations of salt, silk, and steel, and never apologizes for the cost. The canals of Venice did double duty as thoroughfares and as sewers. Market waste, fish guts, and human excrement all emptied into the same shimmering waterways that ferried gondolas and galleys. No one pretended otherwise. The stench was constant, a miasma of decay, brine, and organic rot. The wealthy masked it with perfume, dousing themselves in floral oils and musk, but the smell clung stubbornly beneath. Still, people adapted. You got used to it. Everyone did, and everywhere. People thronged the narrow streets and bridges. Nobles in their signature black robes, the uniform of the ruling class projecting solemn dignity. Merchants swathed in expensive furs, counting coins with practiced fingers. Servants, sailors, from every port in the Mediterranean, enslaved men and women performing invisible labor. Courtesans so renowned they published poetry and advised dukes. Beggars clustering outside churches, hands outstretched. Priests in cassocks, soldiers in armor, glassblowers with scarred hands, printers whose fingers were permanently stained with ink. One bridge stood apart from the rest, the Bridge of Sighs, linking the Doge's palace to the prison next door. Condemned men crossed it on their way to confinement, catching a final glimpse of the lagoon through its tiny stone windows. That fleeting view of beauty before descent into darkness gave the bridge its name, the sigh of a soul saying goodbye to light. Venice was never kind. Kindness was a luxury republics couldn't afford, but it was undeniably, impossibly, heart-stoppingly beautiful, a city that defied physics and reason, built not on stone but on wooden stakes driven into mud, rising from the water like a vision conjured by poets and sustained by sheer will. Travelers wrote home in awe. A French diplomat once called it the most triumphant city I have ever seen. Peter, the great humanist poet, praised it as rich in gold, but richer in fame, strong in power, but stronger in virtue. The virtue part may have been generous, but the rest rang true at its height. Venice stood as the wealthiest, most powerful, and most admired city in Italy, perhaps in all of Europe. A millennium of calculated trade, shrewd diplomacy, and relentless warfare had forged something unprecedented. A republic of merchants that outlasted empires. An archipelago of influence that ruled the seas. And it wasn't only trade and war that shaped its splendor. Architecture played its part. Andrea Palladio arrived in Venice and redefined beauty itself. His buildings, clean-lined, harmonious, echoing the grandeur of ancient Rome, rose along the Grand Canal with serene authority. His churches, palaces, and villas became templates for generations. Centuries later, his influence would stretch across oceans. Every stately government building, with white columns and triangular pediments, owes its form to Palladio. You're welcome, but golden ages, no matter how luminous, are never immune to shadow. Venice had a habit of being shattered by mass death. The Black Death swept through in the mid-14th century, claiming perhaps a third of its population. Bodies piled faster than gravediggers could bury them. Still, Venice recovered as it always did. Yet plague returned again and again in the early 16th century, then again in the 1570s, each time cutting the city's population down like a scythe. With every outbreak, Venice responded not with panic, but with innovation. It established one of Europe's first public health boards. It built plague hospitals on isolated islands in the lagoon. It burned the belongings of the dead. And it invented the concept of quarantina, from the Venetian word for 40. Ships arriving from infected ports had to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. The practice worked better than most alternatives, slowing the spread of disease centuries before germ theory existed. Venice had a habit of being shattered by mass death. The Black Death swept through in the mid-14th century, claiming perhaps a third of its population. Bodies piled faster than gravediggers could bury them. Still, Venice recovered, as it always did. Yet plague returned, again and again, in the early 16th century. Then again in the 1570s, each time cutting the city's population down like a scythe. With every outbreak, Venice responded not with panic, but with innovation. It established one of Europe's first public health boards. It built plague hospitals on isolated islands in the lagoon. It burned the belongings of the dead. And it invented the concept of quarantina, from the Venetian word for 40. Ships arriving from infected ports had to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. The practice worked better than most alternatives, slowing the spread of disease centuries before germ theory existed. The plague of 1576 claimed Titian the greatest painter Venice had ever produced. In his late 80s, a near miraculous age for the time, he succumbed to the same pestilence that felled dockworkers and beggars. Normally, plague deaths were handled with clinical efficiency. No funerals, no gatherings, bodies buried swiftly and silently. But for Titian, Venice broke its own rules. A funeral mass was held in the Frari church. Mourners filled the pews. This exception spoke volumes in Venice. Art was not mere decoration, it was part of the Republic's soul. But empires, however radiant, attract enemies. And Venice had made many. Across the sea, the Ottoman Empire watched, having captured Constantinople decades earlier, ending the Byzantine Empire that Venice had once reshaped through cunning and crusade. The Ottomans continued their relentless westward expansion, island by island, fortress by fortress. Venice's far-flung empire was squarely in their sights. When news of Constantinople's fall first reached the lagoon, the Venetian response was characteristically pragmatic. No calls for holy war, no outraged manifestos. Instead, envoys were dispatched not to fight, but to negotiate. Fine, they seemed to say, Constantinople is yours. Now, are you still buying pepper? Because we have pepper. Remarkably, it worked at first. The Sultan allowed Venetian merchants to retain their trading rights. Spices still flowed. Gold still filled Venetian coffers. But beneath the surface, the balance had shifted. The Ottomans were not content with tribute. They sought dominion. Their armies marched through the Balkans. Their shipyards, rivaling the arsenal in scale, produced galleys at an alarming pace. Their foundries cast cannons, larger and more powerful than Venice's officials, once open to bribes, grew less pliable. The message was clear: the age of Venetian supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean was ending. The first major blow fell at Negroponte Euboea, to the Greeksa Long Island off Greece that Venice had held for over 2 centuries. When the Ottomans attacked, the Venetian garrison held out for a month against overwhelming force. When the walls finally fell, the Ottomans showed no mercy. The governor was sawn in half. The population was enslaved or slaughtered. The message was unambiguous: Venice was no longer untouchable. The wars dragged on for decades. Venice won some battles, lost others. Its once unrivaled navy now faced Ottoman fleets built in shipyards that mirrored the arsenal's efficiency. Admirals like Harridan Barbarossa, former corsair turned imperial commander, Venetian captains who had grown complacent in their belief that the sea belonged to them. By right, by the turn of the 16th century, Venice had lost the eyes of the Republic, Modena and Corinth, the twin ports that once guarded the maritime highways to the east. Island by island, harbor by harbor, the Venetian Empire shrank. Diplomatic alliances with other Christian powers collapsed as soon as the immediate threat passed. Fortifications bought time but not victory. Bribes worked until they didn't. Nothing could halt the slow unraveling. Then came Cyprus, strategically vital, rich in resources, and under Venetian control for nearly a century. Cyprus was more than a colony, it was a linchpin. When the Ottoman fleet appeared off its coast, Venice knew this was an existential test. Reinforcements were sent, but the island was distant, and Ottoman control of the seas made resupply nearly impossible. 100,000 Ottoman soldiers landed. The capital, Nicosia, fell after a brutal 7-week siege. 20,000 were slaughtered in the sack. The Venetian governor's severed head was sent to other garrisons as a warning. Only Famagusta held out, commanded by Marcantonio Bragadina, nobleman, soldier, and patriot. Famagusta became a fortress of defiance. With just 7,000 defenders against an army 10 times larger, Bragadin knew relief was unlikely and victory impossible. Yet he fought anyway. For 11 months, the city endured relentless bombardment, disease, starvation, and wave after wave of assault. The Ottomans lost 50,000 men, so many that their generals considered abandoning the siege. Inside the walls, conditions grew monstrous. Gunpowder ran out. Church bells were melted into cannonballs. Horses were eaten, then cats, dogs, rats, even boiled leather. Men died of fever and thirst as often as from enemy fire. Surgeons amputated limbs without anesthesia, holding down screaming soldiers in makeshift hospitals overflowing with the dying. Through it all, Bragadin walked the ramparts, gaunt, exhausted, but resolute. He refused to surrender until there was literally nothing left to defend. In the end, he negotiated terms. His men would be allowed to leave with honor, weapons in hand, under safe passage. The Ottoman commander, Lala Mustafa Pasha, agreed. He signed the documents. He shook Bragadin's hand. Then he broke every promise. As Bragadin came to finalize the surrender, he was seized. Accused rightly or not of executing Turkish prisoners, he was subjected to unspeakable torture. His ears and nose were cut off. He was forced to carry earth in baskets, beaten as he staggered. Then, In the central square, he was flayed alive, slowly, meticulously, from the feet upward. Witnesses say he recited psalms until he lost consciousness. His skin was stuffed with straw, dressed in his uniform, and paraded through the streets. It was then hoisted on the mast of the Ottoman flagship and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. When news reached Venice, the city recoiled in horror and fury. This was not business. This was not diplomacy. This was personal. Bragadin was one of their Venetian noble who had given everything for the Republic, only to be skinned like an animal. For the first time in generations, Venice wanted not profit, but vengeance, and, for once, Christendom agreed. Pope Pius V, long frustrated by Europe's indifference to the Ottoman threat, found a cause that finally united the fractured powers. Spain, the Papal States, and others joined Venice in forming the Holy Liga coalition of unprecedented scale in the autumn. The Christian fleet, over 200 galleys, 50,000 men, sailed to meet the Ottomans in the Gulf of Patras. There, off the coast of Lepanto, they found the enemy, 230 Ottoman galleys, battle-hardened and confident. What followed was the largest naval battle in the age of oared warfare. At dawn, the two fleets collided like thunder. Galleys rammed, grappled, and locked together, becoming floating arenas of hand-to-hand combat. Cannons roared at point-blank range. Arrows, musket fire, and crossbow bolts tore through packed ranks. The sea turned red with blood. Boats drifted among oars and rigging. The Venetians fought with berserker fury, Bragadin's face in their minds, his screams in their ears. Every Ottoman they killed felt like justice. After 5 hours of slaughter, the Ottoman fleet was shattered. 170 ships captured or sunk. Senwen, Ottomans dead. 15,000 Christian galley slaves freed, many joining the fight with desperate courage. The Christian losses were heavy. 7,000 dead, but it was an overwhelming victory. Church bells rang from Lisbon to Vienna. Bonfires lit the night. For one fleeting moment, Europe stood united in triumph. Sebastiano Venier, the 75-year-old Venetian admiral, fought on the front lines with sword in hand. When the battle ended, he wept. Venice had its revenge. Bragadin was avenged, but the victory was hollow. The Ottoman Empire was vast. Losing a fleet hurt, but not fatally. Within months, new galleys rolled from their shipyards. Experienced sailors were harder to replace, but the Sultan's resources were nearly bottomless. Cyprus remained under Ottoman control for the next 3 centuries. Worse, the Holy League quickly unraveled. Spain and Venice quarreled over strategy. The Pope died. His successor had other priorities. Within 2 years, Venice signed a separate peace with the Ottomans, formally ceding Cyprus in exchange for the right to continue trading business. As always, resumed, yet something fundamental had changed. Venice was no longer the undisputed master of the eastern seas. New powers were rising. Portuguese caravels now sailed around Africa, bypassing the Mediterranean entirely, draining Venice's trade routes of their lifeblood. The Atlantic nation Spain, France, England were turning their gaze westward, toward oceans and empires Venice could not reach. The Republic remained magnificent. Its painters still captured light in oil. Its printers still spread ideas across Europe. To visitors, Venice seemed unchanged, an eternal city, floating in timeless splendor. But the Venetians knew better. In council chambers and counting houses, in hushed conversations after official meetings, they sensed the shift. Their moment was passing. The confidence that had carried them through centuries, that Venice would always adapt, always survive, always come out. As Bragadin came to finalize the surrender, he was seized, accused, rightly or not, of executing Turkish prisoners. He was subjected to unspeakable torture. His ears and nose were cut off. He was forced to carry earth in baskets, beaten as he staggered. Then, in the central square, he was flayed, alive slowly, meticulously, from the feet upward. Witnesses say he recited psalms until he lost consciousness. His skin was stuffed with straw, dressed in his uniform, and paraded through the streets. It was then hoisted on the mast of the Ottoman flagship and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. When news reached Venice, the city recoiled in horror and fury. This was not business. This was not diplomacy. This was personal. Bragadin was one of their own Venetian noble who had given everything for the Republic, only to be skinned like an animal. For the first time in generations, Venice wanted not profit, but vengeance, and for once Christendom agreed. Pope Pius V, long frustrated by Europe's indifference to the Ottoman threat, found a cause that finally united the fractured powers. Spain, the Papal States, Genoa, Savoy, and others joined Venice in forming the Holy Liga coalition of unprecedented scale. In the autumn, the Christian fleets, over 200 galleys, 50,000 men, sailed to meet the Ottomans in the Gulf of Patras. There, off the coast of Lepanto, they found the enemy, 230 Ottoman galleys, battle-hardened and confident. What followed was the largest naval battle in the age of oared warfare. At dawn, the two fleets collided like thunder. Galleys rammed, grappled, and locked together, becoming floating arenas of hand-to-hand combat. Cannons roared at point-blank range. Arrows, musket fire, and crossbow bolts tore through packed ranks. The sea turned red with blood. Bodies drifted among oars and rigging. The Venetians fought with berserker fury, Bragadin's face in their minds, his screams in their ears. Every Ottoman they killed felt like justice. After 5 hours of slaughter, the Ottoman fleet was shattered. 170 ships captured or sunk. 1 Ottomans dead. 15,000 Christian galley slaves freed, many joining the fight with desperate courage. The Christian losses were heavy, 7,000 dead, but it was an overwhelming victory. Church bells rang from Lisbon to Vienna. Bonfires lit the night. For one fleeting moment, Europe stood united in triumph. Sebastiano Venier, the 75-year-old Venetian admiral, fought on the front lines with sword in hand. When the battle ended, he wept. Venice had its revenge. Bragadin was avenged, but the victory was hollow. The Ottoman Empire was vast. Losing a fleet hurt, but not fatally. Within months, new galleys rolled from their shipyards. Experienced sailors were harder to replace, but the Sultan's resources were nearly bottomless. Cyprus remained under Ottoman control for the next 3 centuries. Worse, the Holy League quickly unraveled. Spain and Venice quarreled over strategy. The Pope died. His successor had other priorities. Within 2 years, Venice signed a separate peace with the Ottomans, formally ceding Cyprus in exchange for the right to continue trading. Business, as always, resumed. Yet something fundamental had changed. Venice was no longer the undisputed master of the eastern seas. New powers were rising. Portuguese caravels now sailed around Africa, bypassing the Mediterranean entirely, draining Venice's trade routes of their lifeblood. The Atlantic nations, Spain, France, England, were turning their gaze westward, toward oceans and empires Venice could not reach. The Republic remained magnificent. Its palaces still rose along the Grand Canal. Its painters still captured light in oil. Its printers still spread ideas across Europe. To visitors, Venice seemed unchanged, an eternal city, floating in timeless splendor. But the Venetians knew better. In council chambers and counting houses, in hushed conversations after official meetings, they sensed the shift. Their moment was passing. The confidence that had carried them through centuries, that Venice would always adapt, always survive, always come out ahead, was fraying. Lepanto, for all its glory, was not a beginning. It was a high-water mark. Everything after would be about holding on, defending what remained, delaying the inevitable, and far away. In a former cathedral-turned-mosque in Constantinople, Bragadin's stuffed skin still hung a trophy, a warning, a silent testament that even the mightiest fall, yet Venice, ever stubborn, was not done. One last miracle remained on. It came with a cat. Her name was Nena, small, grand white, with a face so gentle that strangers couldn't resist scratching behind her ears. She belonged to Francesco Morosini, the last great Venetian hero of the East. He took her everywhere, to council meetings, ship inspections, even into battle. Yasantu warships, amid roaring cannons and screaming men, Nena perched calmly on his shoulder, utterly unfazed by chaos. Cats, after all, care little for human drama. People called Morosini eccentric. Some whispered he was half mad. But no one dared say it aloud, because while others lamented Venice's decline from gilded palaces, Morosini was still fighting. He had bled for the Republic. He had held fortresses deemed indefensible. And through every siege, every storm, every hopeless campaign, Nena was there thither as a talisman of luck, or simply as quiet companionship. Soldiers swore she had survived more battles than most veterans in the late 17th century. The fiercest fighting was on Crete, Venice's last great stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. Everything else had been peeled away, island by island. Crete was the final bastion, and Morosini, with his cat on his shoulder, sailed to defend it, because Venice, even in twilight, never stopped fighting. Not yet, not while there was still a lagoon to call home, a wooden stake to drive into the mud, and a single ship left to sail. Over the centuries, as Venice's dominions in the eastern Mediterranean steadily ceded or abandoned, one jewel remained. Crete, it was not just any possession. With a population of 250,000 fertile soil that fed armies, and harbors commanding vital sea lanes, Crete was the kind of territory empires fought for over generations, and the Ottomans had long coveted it. Their opportunity came under the thin veil of justification. Maltese Knights, Christian corsairs, operating from the central Mediterranean, had seized an Ottoman ship carrying pilgrims to Mecca. They brought their prize to Crete to sell the cargo. The Sultan, outraged by the desecration of a holy voyage, demanded the pirates be handed over. Venice refused. Whether they genuinely could not locate the corsairs, or simply chose not to expend the effort mattered little. The Sultan had all the pretext he needed. A vast Ottoman armada descended upon Crete. Tens of thousands of soldiers landed on its shores, sweeping inland with terrifying speed. Town after town fell. Fortress after fortress surrendered. Within 2 years, almost the entire island was under Ottoman control, except for one defiant holdout, Candia. Candia was more than Crete's capital. It was the nerve center of Venetian power in the east, home to the governor, the treasury, and the largest garrison. It boasted fortifications among the most advanced in the Mediterranean, engineered by masters of military architecture, layered with bastions, moats, and reinforced walls designed to absorb the worst of modern siege warfare. The Ottomans, confident in their numbers and momentum, prepared for what they assumed would be a campaign of months, perhaps a year at most. It lasted 21 years, 21 years of unrelenting siege. Imagine it. A child born in the first months of the blockade would reach adulthood, marry, and perhaps become a parent themselves before the final shot was fired. Entire generations knew only war. Soldiers who arrived as eager youths departed they survived as weathered veterans, hollow-eyed and scarred. The Ottomans threw everything they had at those walls, relentless artillery barrages that shook the earth, underground mines meant to collapse bastions from below, wave after wave of infantry charging into murderous crossfire. They lost men by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. Disease festered in their overcrowded camps. Supplies dwindled. Commanders rotated in disgrace, replaced by others who fared no better. The Sultan himself grew increasingly impatient, dispatching furious edicts demanding to know why one stubborn city defied his empire for so long. Inside Candia, conditions were no less hellish. The garrison dwindled as death and desertion took their toll. Reinforcements from Venice arrived sporadically, ships slipping through the Ottoman blockade under cover of night, delivering gunpowder, grain, and fresh recruits, only to vanish again into the open sea. Food grew scarce. Water was rationed. The constant thunder of cannon fire wore down nerves until sleep became a luxury. Shells fell without warning, turning streets into craters, homes into rubble. Civilians learned to live underground. Tunnels connected strongpoints. Bunkers were carved into the earth behind the walls. You moved quickly in the open, darting between cover, hoping Ottoman gunners had their sights elsewhere. Children raised in this crucible knew no other world. They played among shattered stone, collected spent musket balls, and twisted cannon fragments like seashells. Some grew old enough to take up arms before the siege ended, defending a city they had never seen in peace. Death was omnipresent. Bodies were buried when time allowed, left to rot when it didn't. The stench of decay mingled with gunpowder and smoke until the two became indistinguishable. Priests moved endlessly through the ruins, administering last rites with such frequency that the sacred words began to sound mechanical, grim assembly line of salvation for souls passing into eternity. Yet, against all logic, Candia was more than Crete's capital. It was the nerve center of Venetian power in the east, home to the governor, the treasury, and the largest garrison. It boasted fortifications among the most advanced in the Mediterranean, engineered by masters of military architecture. Layered with bastions, moats, and reinforced walls designed to absorb the worst of modern siege warfare. The Ottomans, confident in their numbers and momentum, prepared for what they assumed would be a campaign of months, perhaps a year at most. It lasted 21 years. 21 years of unrelenting siege. Imagine it. A child born in the first months of the blockade would reach adulthood, marry, and perhaps become a parent themselves before the final shot was fired. Entire generations knew only war. Soldiers who arrived as eager youths departed diff. They survived, veterans hollow-eyed. The Ottomans threw everything they had at those walls. Relentless artillery barrages that shook the earth. Underground mines meant to collapse bastions from below. Wave after wave of infantry charging into murderous crossfire. They lost men by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. Disease festered in their overcrowded camps. Supplies dwindled. Commanders rotated in disgrace, replaced by others who fared no better. The Sultan himself grew increasingly impatient, dispatching furious edicts, demanding to know why one stubborn city defied his empire for so long. Inside Candia, conditions were no less hellish. The garrison dwindled as death and desertion took their toll. Reinforcements from Venice arrived sporadically, ships slipping through the Ottoman blockade under cover of night, delivering gunpowder, grain, and fresh recruits, only to vanish again into the open sea. Food grew scarce. Water was rationed. The constant thunder of cannon fire wore down nerves until sleep became a luxury. Shells fell without warning, turning streets into craters, homes into rubble. Civilians learned to live. Underground tunnels connected strongpoints. Bunkers were carved into the earth behind the walls. You moved quickly in the open, darting between cover, hoping Ottoman gunners had their sights elsewhere. Children raised in this crucible knew no other world. They played among shattered stone, collected spent musket balls, and twisted cannon fragments like seashells. Some grew old enough to take up arms before the siege ended, defending a city they had never seen in peace. Death was omnipresent. Bodies were buried when time allowed, left to rot when it didn't. The stench of decay mingled with gunpowder and smoke until the two became indistinguishable. Priests moved endlessly through the ruins, administering last rites with such frequency that the sacred words began to sound mechanically, grim assembly line of salvation for souls passing into eternity. Yet, against all logic, Candia held. Venice sent what aid it could. Volunteers from across Christendom arrived, Maltese knights seeking redemption, French nobles chasing glory, German mercenaries drawn by gold and chaos. Even the Pope dispatched troops. It was never enough to lift the siege, but it was enough to keep the flame alive. Year after year, Candia resisted, bleeding the Ottomans dry in a war of attrition that drained their treasury and shattered their morale. Then, near the end of this epic struggle, Francesco Morosini arrived. Appointed Captain General, the highest military command Venice could bestow, his mission was clear: hold Candia at all costs. Or, if that proved impossible, make the Ottomans pay so dearly that they would never again view Venice as an easy target. Morosini threw himself into the defense with desperate energy. He reorganized the exhausted garrison, repaired battered fortifications, and launched daring night raids against Ottoman trenches, striking where they least expected it, using surprise to amplify his meager forces. And through it all, perched calmly on his shoulder, sat his cat, Nena, watching the carnage with unblinking yellow eyes, indifferent to the thunder of war. In 1668, the Ottomans launched their greatest assault, yet thousands of men surging toward the breaches in a final, furious bid to end the siege. The fighting raged for days. Hand-to-hand combat filled shattered walls. Corpses piled so high they blocked the gates. The noise never ceased, not by day, not by night. Yet somehow Candia endured. The walls were reduced to rubble in places, the defenders barely able to stand. But the Venetian flag still flew. Then came the betrayal. France, under Louis XIV, had sent 6,000 well-equipped troops, a formidable reinforcement that briefly shifted the balance. For a few months, hope flickered. But then Louis, swayed by shifting politics at home and rivalries abroad, abruptly recalled his army. In the late summer, the French ships sailed away, leaving Candia to its fate. Morosine watched them disappear over the horizon from the ramparts, knowing what it meant. Without relief, without fresh troops, the city could not hold much longer. Still, he fought on another month of bombardment, another month of dying for a cause already lost at last. With honor intact and his men on the brink of annihilation, Morosine negotiated surrender. The terms were generous by the brutal standards of siege warfare. The garrison could depart with weapons and colors. Civilians who wished to leave could do so unmolested. No massacre, no enslavement, just the quiet end of 465 years of Venetian rule over Crete. On the day he sailed away, Nena sat beside him on the deck. Behind them, the Ottomans entered a city in ruins of victory that had cost them over 100,000 lives. Venice had lost Crete, yes, but it had bled the Ottomans white in the process, and Morosine would not forget. 14 years later, the Ottomans committed a catastrophic error. They marched on Vienna with an army so vast it seemed unstoppable, rumored to number 200,000, though likely fewer. It was the greatest Ottoman threat to Central Europe in living memory. They expected the city to fall swiftly. They were wrong. A coalition army, led by the Polish King Jan III Sobieski, arrived just in time. On a September morning, Polish hussars' wings, gleaming, lances lowered, charged down the hills in one of history's most decisive cavalry assaults. The Ottoman lines shattered. The Sultan's army fled in panic, abandoning tents, cannons, and treasure. The siege of Vienna collapsed into the greatest Ottoman defeat in centuries. For Venice, it was a signal. The balance had shifted. The Ottomans were vulnerable, and Morosine, now older, wiser, still accompanied by his ever-present cat, would soon lead a Venetian fleet eastward once more, not to defend, but to reclaim. Revenge, it seemed, was a dish best served not only cold, but with feline composure. Centuries earlier, long before cannons thundered at Candia or galleys clashed at Lepanto, the foundations of this improbable republic were laid in humility. Picture a torchlit hall on a marshy island in the lagoon sometime in the early 8th century. Rough-hewn timber walls rise around a gathering of elders, their faces lined by wind and salt, dressed in simple wool tunics dyed with the muted colors of earth and red. They have come from scattered settlements, Storcello, Heraclea, Malumico, drawn together by necessity, not ambition. In the center of the room, discussion grows urgent. Pirates raid their shores. Byzantine officials demand tribute. The mainland burns with war. Someone must speak for them all. Someone must lead. Hands rise in the flickering light. Voices murmur names. After debate, consensus forms. An elderly, man-respected, experienced, known for fairnesses chosen, not crowned by divine right, not seized by force, but elected by peers. A simple circlet, perhaps, of woven reeds or polished bronze, is placed upon his brow. He becomes the dux the leader. In the Venetian tongue, the doge firelight dances on the walls, casting long shadows that seem to stretch into the future. No one present knows they are witnessing the birth of a republic that will endure 1,000 years. No one dreams of marble palaces, golden mosaics, or fleets that rule the sea. They are refugees, survivors, builders of huts on mud. But in this moment, they choose order over chaos, consensus over conquest, collective will over tyranny. The scene is intimate, humble, yet charged with destiny, captured in warm amber tones, grainy as old film, like a scene from a History Channel documentary brought to life by candle and courage. This is where it all began, not with empire, but with agreement, not with gold, but with grit, not with conquest, but with a single, shared decision to build something that might last.